Channel is going to be something I've never done on here, and that is going to be a full kitchen build. So this is obviously the kitchen I worked on. That was before the initial cabinets were installed, and this was after the first round of cabinets I put in what everything looks like. I also did some uppers in this room, and I'm going to be doing a vent hood for the stove. All of that will be in this series. So if this is something you've thought of trying for yourself, I tried to design this series to make it extremely comprehensive and knowledgeable for people that are thinking about doing this themselves. So I made a video last week where I kind of explained what to expect. So I'm going to go through the beginning of this pretty quickly, and that is that you want to plan this out to a T. I used SketchUp to draw up all the cabinets. The customer saw them, approved everything. We tweaked the numbers, went through multiple versions before I even cut any wood. The wood I'm using for this is pre-finished birch plywood. It's 3/4 inch ply. I'm also going to be using some 1/2 inch for the backers. And what I started with in real life and what I'm starting with in the video is this set of 3 cabinets, a corner cabinet, a bank of drawers, and a sink cabinet. So if you want to skip to the build, you can, but like I said, I'm gearing this towards people that are novices at this and don't know much. The nice thing about kitchen cabinets is they're going to be standard sizes. So you can see I drew all this out on my whiteboard before I started. So I have a final depth and a final height because you have to account for the countertop, which is going to be dependent on what you choose. Usually that's about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches thickness. Then you have to decide your construction. I'm using an integrated face frame. I'm using rabbets to join the backer. I'm using dados to join my shelves. So that means my measurements are going to be a little bit different than people that are using butt joints. So you can see I subtracted that integrated face frame in the front, which will be 3/8 of an inch to get the depths of my sides. Once you have all your dimensions, all of my sides are going to be identical, and you'll see I could piece them out. I also know I'm using a 1/2 inch backer. I know some people think that's overkill. Personally, I like using a 1/2 inch backer, especially for heavy cabinets. And honestly, with the price of materials nowadays, a 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch ply is like less than $10 difference. Before I started, I decided if this was going to be a frameless or a frame cabinet. Most people are going to go with a frame cabinet, and I decided on all my widths for my stiles, my top rail and my bottom rail, and then also the overhang off the bottom and how tall my toe kick was going to be. I also decided if that toe kick was going to be detachable, which in my circumstance it was. Because I have an overhang on that bottom rail, I could calculate the height of my toe kick, the height of my cabinets, the total height, and then I could go about cutting all of my pieces. A detachable toe kick is going to be a little bit more work with the way that I did it, but I'm actually really happy I did it. As I mentioned in the first video, the corner cabinet would not have fit in this house if I was not able to take that toe kick off. So I started with my cut list. Like I said, once you draw this out and plan your math, because this is standard sizes, the island's going to be a little bit different. But all those 3 cabinets, as you see, they're very differently designed. They serve 3 very different functions, but all of my side panels are going to be made the exact same way. So I could go through and piece these out. I'll be able to get 6 pieces out of 1 sheet of ply because I could rip it in 2 and then slice it into 3 heights, which is what will fit on this sheet of ply. So I get all my pieces out of 1. Now in my shop, as you can see, I don't have a lot of big fancy tools. I basically built this with the table saw and a radial arm saw, but that means all my cross cuts I'm doing on the radial arm saw. It's a tight fit, but it does work. I have a newer blade in here, but even after a couple cuts, tear out is going to be a problem. I've tried all the tricks to avoid tear out on the radial arm saw. I still get it, but the nice thing about the way I construct things with rabbet and dados, the bottoms of these cabinets you're either never going to see because they're going to be covered by other cabinets or covered by an appliance, or I'm going to be trimming that off anyway because I'm going to be using a rabbet. So that's how I kind of get around the tear out issue. You could see in the beginning it wasn't bad, but it is something to think about. So then to start building these, like I said, I'm going to be putting rabbits and dados on all of my pieces. So I set my sacrificial fence up, and I'm going to be cutting the tops and the bottoms first. So this plywood's 3/4 inch ply, but it's not a true 3/4. It's always a little bit thinner than that. So if you have a dado set, they're going to give you shims so you could dial it in. Before I make any cuts, I always make sure that all of my pieces fit. If you're ordering a big stack of plywood, I didn't have a problem with this stack of ply, but if you're ordering a big stack of plywood, sometimes the dimensions even within that stack are different. So basically my sides, the bottom's going to meet the toe kick, the top's going to meet the countertop. So I'm putting a rabbit on the bottom, a rabbit on the top, and then I'm either going to have a full panel, which is going to be the base, or I'll have segregated panels on the top. Now because I had enough ply, I ended up not doing segregated panels, which are basically just not full sheets. So that wasn't really an issue, but that is all I'm doing. It's 2 cuts on each side, and then I'll go about doing the backer. So the backer is a 1/2 inch, so I have to go and just move my sacrificial fence over a little bit, and obviously the backer is going to go on one side of both of my pieces. So at this point, you are now designated the front and the back. Beforehand, it was just top and bottom. That's important going forward because you have to make these in sets of 2. If you go and do the same thing to all of your pieces at this point, you'll have 6 identical sides instead of 6 mirrored sides, which will be a problem. I'm giving myself 1/4 inch breathing room in between all of my cabinets, which I recommend, especially since I knew going into this space, especially the corner and the floors and spots, were severely out of square. So that will allow me some wiggle room to move stuff around. And to start, I'm going to be cutting out the Lazy Susan top. Corner cabinets, I don't make kitchen cabinets for a living, but I've made a lot of cabinets. So in order to kind of see the way people do things, I watched a couple videos myself, found a guy who makes really nice cabinets. I'll try and remember to link it in the description for people that want to watch it. And he pretty much warned me about corner cabinets, and he was not wrong. They're huge and they're a pain to make. So basically what I'm showing you is for my Lazy Susan, I have a 1/2 inch in the back, but since it's in the corner, and I know that corner's out of square, I actually decided to make that rabbit in the back 1 inch, which means I'll have a 1/2 inch flange. If I get to the space and I have to trim off part of the back of the Lazy Susan cabinet in order to get it to fit, I now have that option. So I basically just made a shim in the back, and then I could go about and cut out the top. Now this is going to be an inset door on a fixed Lazy Susan, so there's really no room for error with this process. If you want a Lazy Susan and you're a novice, a DIYer, I'm going to recommend doing overlay doors or a different option. With the fixed door, as you'll see when I build this, it was a pain, and to get everything lined up is something that admittedly is probably a little bit outside of especially a novice DIYer's skill set. But in order to make this, basically that corner cabinet is going to be about 36 inches by 36 inches. So I just line this up with my cutouts on my previous sides. I can mark where the square I have to make cutout is, and I decided to cut this out on the table saw. It's going to leave 2 grooves on the bottom, but like I said, it's really important that this front is perfectly square. Otherwise, when you go to put your fixed doors in place, you'll have parts that won't line up. So the part of starting with this is getting it right from the beginning, and that is how the tray is going to fit inside. So you'll have little curves on the top and bottom. All I did was cheated the curves to the top side and the bottom side, not the interior of the cabinet, so you'll never see them. And then I just went and cut out my backer to cover the back. The other problem with the Lazy Susan is because it only essentially has those two sides. It was a pain to put together for one person. So you can see I kind of had a spacer in there to hold it up. And for the time being, I'm dry fitting all of these together just with a couple screws. So the backer is just going to be the same height as my cabinet sides and the same width, and I could just pop them in place. So with the Lazy Susan carcass kind of roughed out, I switched to the bank of drawers. It's going to have a couple different partitions, and like I said, at this point there's a designated front and back, so I have to be careful to make sure I'm cutting these differently, not the same, which will make more sense in the next clip. I marked out where all of my cuts are going to be, so I got my spacing right, and the face frame in the front is going to be 1 inch, so you could see I accounted for that in the design. So the dados, once again, this plywood is not going to be a true 3/4. So you could see if you have your dado stacked too wide, it will wiggle around on you, which you really don't want. You want it to be a nice clean fit. So I dialed that in with the shims that came with the set. You could see I made a couple passes, but it's worth it because if you have this wrong, you're going to mess up all of your slots. And then I could use my initial piece and send all of my pieces forward. So as you can see right now, I'm sending this facing front forward, which will give me that bottom dado cut. On the next piece, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to send it with the back facing forward. So by sending this through and flipping it, it's going to give me the same cut. If I sent all of my panels through the same way, I won't have it, then I didn't designate the front and the back. You're going to end up with two identical panels that won't flip to make your two sides. So that's just important to remember when you're making any sort of sides of a piece or you're making these sorts of cuts. One cut's going to get sent through face first, the other one backside first. So you can see when I'm lining them up, now they line up perfectly, which is exactly what I want. I could slide my fence over, line it up roughly with my next mark. Obviously I want this to be a certain size, but they don't have to be perfect. If you're off by 1/16 of an inch, at least for this process, it's not that big of a deal. Same thing. One through with the front facing first, one through with the back facing first, and it will give me the cut on to match. So you can see how now they line up, and I did the last one, didn't film it because it's the same process, but that is what the bank of drawers will look like. Before I did that, I have the kitchen cabinet here for the sink. It's going to be, the sides are exactly the same, but because this is going to have a big sink in it, I really can't put a lot of bracing across the top. So what I'm going to do is cut a dado in the front because I have to account for my integrated face frame and that front there, and then another one in the back, and then I'll have two verticals that will go across the front to kind of help hold everything up. So the easiest way to cut those was to cut them as a stop on the radial arm saw. So I have my marks there. You can see I could come all the way down, remove the material I need. The only problem with this process is that the saw blade is going to give you a rounded overcut on the bottom. So I just have to go through and chisel out that excess. But that is what that looks like. There's the back and the front. The back will obviously account for that vertical as well as the backer. And then, like I said, just have to go through and chisel out that material to square out that dado in the front there. So pretty simple. It's not a lot of material. Plywood's sloppy to chisel, but it chisels pretty cleanly because the layers just kind of flake off in order to square that up. So at this point I could start making my partitions if I have any of them, and I could start making my tops. So I'm going to subtract. The dados are about 3/8 of an inch into roughly 3/4 inch material. So that means if you double that up, because I have two sides, I'm taking my final width and I'm subtracting a 3/4 from it to get what the width I needed. So that's how I calculate how wide it's going to be. The width I need minus the thickness of the dados. And then for the bank of drawers, all of my shelving is going to be the exact same size, because because right now I'm creating my widths, so it's pretty easy. Once I know that one number, I could go through and cut all of my pieces. So a lot of this process, which I'm going to go through a little bit quicker now, is ripping stuff down on the table saw, cross-cutting it on the cross-cut sled, and then putting stuff in place. So those are my panels there, and I could keep going until I get all of the pieces. So like I said, the sides are the same on all of these cabinets. So I have a full bottom on the sink cabinet, which is what you saw me just cut, and then I have these slatted pieces in the front, which I'm calling verticals, and those are going to be supports to hold up the sink. This will also have another 3/4 inch front in it, as well as the backer in the 1/2 inch backer, so that should be more than enough to hold up that countertop, because the sink takes up almost that entire open area. Then for the bank of the drawers, same process. I just calculated the width, cut those slats. You could see I used slats in that circumstance. You don't really need full pieces, it's just going to add to the weight of it. And then at this point I have everything dry fit, so just some screws in it. I pre-drill all the holes, which makes life easier. So before I can glue these together, I'm going to be adding an integrated tongue. This is what that's going to look like. It's basically a 3/8 inch by 1/4 thickness tongue in the front. I make that by making a top side and bottom side rabbet. It leaves me with that tongue. This is going on the front side of all of my cabinets. If you don't want to do this, you do not have to do this. You could do butt joints at the front, and you could make face frames that are attached with biscuits or pocket hole screws and avoid this step. I like this step because I find it to be a really structural once it's all together, attaching the face frame with those splines. So I basically just all of my cabinets apart, and the front side of all of my pieces, I run through the stack, the top and the bottom. I do it on all of the slatted fronts. The Lazy Susan front, you'll see I could only do the sides, but the sides of my drawer boxes, anything that's going to get a face frame will get run through the saw, and all of those parts will get done at the same time so that it's accurate. That 1/4 inch groove that's left, that spline, I can then put a 1/4 inch dado stack in my saw when I go to cut the face frames, cut a perfect 1/4 inch groove, and all of my pieces will fit. Now for the Lazy Susan, another reason why the corner cabinet will be your arch nemesis during this process is I obviously cannot send these angled pieces through the table saw, so I had to cut that groove with a router. Not a huge deal. I have a rabbiting bit for the router, but a longer process. As you can see, I cut the top and the bottom so that I now have that spline, the top and the bottom of the Lazy Susan, to match the other ones I have. Gluing the Lazy Susan together was a hassle in and of itself. I don't have video footage of that, unfortunately, but you saw how I dry fit it together. It was essentially the same process, but with glue. The other problem with this is I like to measure diagonals for square, and there's not a lot of flat surfaces on this. I managed to measure diagonal in the front opening of that, and it seemed like it was pretty square. I threw a square on there, even though that's not always the most accurate way to calculate that because this plywood's not perfectly flat, but at the end of the day that glue up ended up working out. For the other two cabinet carcasses, I did the exact same thing, basically just putting them back together. I already have all this stuff pre-drilled. I saw a little tip in a video where he went through and Brad nailed stuff before adding screws, which was actually very helpful for this process because it's just me in the shop. So those brad nails kind of held everything together until I could get screws in there. And then same thing, I could just go through, add of my parts, add my backer with the glue. The one downside to pre-finished plywood is going to be, obviously glue's not going to stick well to that finished surface, so sometimes in spots I actually sanded it lightly to get bare wood. I can measure my diagonals when they matched up. I could put all of the screws in. I don't think I show a picture of the box, but these are screws specifically for cabinet making. Sometimes I use drywall screws in the shop, but for this I went and got screws made for plywood cabinets. And same thing for the bank of drawers. I could go through, you could see how all the grooves are in the front there, and I have them on every single slat so that they fit across the front, and I can have my face frame. I could put my top on and just assemble all of these things. Glue up is going to be super important, because if you glue these up wrong, they're just not gonna, the face frame and the doors and the drawers are going to be 10 times more of a hassle. And then these are the carcasses I have. I wanted to get all 3 of these in one video, but it wasn't going to work. So next week, I didn't want this to be 40 minutes long. I'm going to show you how I add the toe kicks. And then after the toe kicks, I'm going to show you how I made the face frames and all of the fronts for this set of 3 cabinets.